Just as they reached the hallway, the lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Lena's breath hitched, her eyes wide as she tried to adjust to the sudden void. Her heart pounded in her chest, the deafening silence broken only by the frantic scurrying of feet. "Go, go, go!" Daniel urged, grabbing her wrist and pulling her toward the nearest exit. The cold, metallic clang of doors opening in the distance sent a chill up her spine. She could hear them now, footsteps echoing, getting closer. They weren't alone anymore. "Reyes!" Daniel shouted over his shoulder. "Get to the backup generator." The old warehouse hallways felt like a maze as they ran, their footsteps muffled by the thick concrete floors. Lena's head was spinning. They had the data, but the price of getting it was becoming clearer with every passing second. They were being hunted, and time was running out. Lena's stomach churned as they turned another corner. The sound of heavy boots followed them, growing louder and closer. She turned to Daniel, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "Are we going to make it out of here?" Daniel's jaw was set, his face grim. "We have to." Behind them, the unmistakable hum of machinery powered back up. The building's emergency lights flickered to life, casting an eerie glow over the narrow corridor. Just ahead, a steel door stood between them and freedom. But they weren't going to make it that far without a fight. Then a voice, cold and familiar. "Stop right there, Miss Dawson." Lena froze, her pulse spiking. She recognized the voice. It was the same man who had knocked on her door earlier, the one in the black suit. He and his team had been hunting her. The realization hit her like a sledgehammer. They were closer than she thought. "I'm not going back," Lena spat, her voice trembling with defiance. She yanked her wrist from Daniel's grip and stood tall, facing the approaching danger. There was no turning back now. The man in the suit stepped forward from the shadows, flanked by two others. His eyes locked onto Lena, calculating and cold. "You don't have a choice, Lena. GenTrace wants you back." "You don't own me," Lena snapped, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I'm not your experiment. I'm human. I have free will, and I'm done running." A cruel smile spread across the man's face. "Oh, you misunderstand. You never were human. But don't worry, you'll come to understand soon enough." Before Lena could react, he reached for something at his side. A sleek, black device. A taser. The familiar whine of electricity crackled through the air. Her heart skipped a beat as her mind scrambled for a way out. But Daniel was faster. He lunged at the man, knocking him off balance. The taser fired, but the shot missed. "Run," Daniel shouted. Lena didn't need to be told twice. Her legs moved on their own as she sprinted past the two men, who now struggled with Daniel. They were close, but she could feel her escape slipping away with every second. Ahead, the door, her ticket out of this nightmare, was within reach. She threw herself at it, her heart slamming in her chest. The door gave way under a frantic push. The cold night air hit her face, and she stumbled into the alley behind the building. Daniel was right behind her, but the suited men were already on their heels. "Get to the car," Daniel barked, his voice strained. They weren't far from the exit, but the sound of pursuit was growing louder. Lena's legs burned as she pushed herself harder. The weight of the data and the truth, she still couldn't fully grasp, threatening to crush her. She had to survive. She had to finish this. Behind them, the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, echoed down the alley. "They're coming," Daniel muttered, his voice tight with fear. Lena could feel it now. There was no time left. She heard the distinct click of a firearm being loaded. Without thinking, she dove behind a stack of crates, pulling Daniel down with her. They both crouched low, holding their breaths. The footsteps grew nearer, and Lena's heart thundered in her chest. Through the small gap in the crates, she saw the suited men move past them, unaware. Then, as if by some miracle, Daniel grabbed her arm and yanked her to her feet. "This way," he whispered urgently. They turned and ran, weaving through the back streets, trying to outrun the nightmare they'd unleashed. As they reached the darkened corner, Lena's phone buzzed once more. Her hands were shaking as she pulled it out. It was a message from Dr. Reyes. We have the data. The truth is out there. But they will stop at nothing to silence you. Lena read the message. Her throat dry. There was no turning back now. The truth was in her hands. But so were the people who would kill to make sure it stayed hidden. Keep moving, Daniel urged, his voice low and full of urgency. And so they did, disappearing into the darkness. But the question lingered in Lena's mind. How long could they stay one step ahead of the people who had created her? And how far would she go to expose the truth, even if it meant sacrificing herself? Lena's heart raced as they sprinted down the narrow hallway, the heavy sound of boots pounding against the floor echoing behind them. Daniel led the way, his pace never faltering, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Reyes followed closely, the flash drive now secured in his pocket. Are we clear? Lena gasped, struggling to keep up. We're not clear yet, Daniel replied sharply, not looking back. Keep moving. They reached the staircase at the far end of the corridor and hurried up the steps, each of them acutely aware of the limited time they had. The sound of distant shouting and alarms blaring in the background signaled that their presence had been detected. GenTrace wasn't going to let them leave quietly. As they reached the top of the stairs, the door to the rooftop loomed ahead. Lena's pulse quickened. They had no choice now. There was only one way out. The door burst open, revealing the flat rooftop of the GenTrace building. The cool night air hit Lena like a slap, and she shivered involuntarily. The city sprawled beneath them, the lights flickering in the distance, far away from the nightmare they were trying to escape. They'll be on us in seconds, Reyes said, his voice tense. We need to get out of here fast. Daniel glanced at Lena. You ready? Lena hesitated. Her entire life had just been turned upside down. She wasn't sure what to believe anymore. But as she looked at the two men who had risked everything to help her, something deep inside her stirred. A sense of determination. GenTrace might have created her, but they didn't control her. I'm ready, she said, her voice firm, despite the fear that clawed her throat. Daniel motioned toward the edge of the rooftop, where a helicopter waited, its blades spinning in anticipation. Get to the chopper, he ordered. Now! They ran, Lena's legs burning from the exertion. The helicopter was their only hope, their only chance to escape before the building descended into chaos. As they reached the aircraft, the door opened, and a man in a flight suit extended his hand. Hurry, the pilot shouted. Lena climbed in first, followed by Daniel and then Reyes. As the door slammed shut, the helicopter's engines roared to life, and they were airborne within seconds. Lena's heart raced as the helicopter soared into the night sky, the lights of the GenTrace building shrinking into the distance. But she couldn't shake the feeling that their escape was only temporary. They had the data, but GenTrace wouldn't let them go that easily. Whoever was behind the Project Echo experiment wasn't going to let this secret out without a fight. As the helicopter flew into the dark unknown, Lena leaned back against the seat, closing her eyes for a moment. She thought about everything she had learned, about the life she thought she had, about the DNA that wasn't hers, about the people who had manipulated her from the very beginning. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. The next few days were a blur of tension and fear. Lena stayed in hiding with Daniel and Reyes, moving between safe houses and secluded locations. The data they had stolen from GenTrace was encrypted, and it would take time to decode it. But Lena had no doubt that the truth was buried within those files. As the days passed, Lena found herself drawn deeper into the mystery of who or what she really was. Reyes worked tirelessly to decode the data, his eyes scanning the screens with a look of grim determination. Daniel kept watch, always alert, always prepared for the next move. Lena couldn't help but feel a sense of dread hanging over her. She was running out of time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Reyes turned to her, his face grim. We've decrypted the files, he said, and we've learned more than we ever imagined. Lena's stomach churned. What did you find? Reyes tapped a few keys on the keyboard, and a series of documents appeared on the screen. They were old, dated from decades ago, and full of technical jargon that Lena couldn't quite understand. But there was one document that stood out. It was a series of test results and data logs, detailing her creation. Project Echo, Reyes said, his voice tight. It wasn't just about genetic enhancement. It was about creating the perfect human, an artificial life form with no weaknesses, no limitations. Lena's breath caught in her throat. That's me? Reyes nodded. You were part of a secret program, Lena. They want to create soldiers, perfect, unstoppable beings, and you were their prototype. A surge of anger and disbelief filled Lena's chest. They used me as an experiment? Not just you, Daniel interjected, his voice hard. There are others. You're not the only one. But you were different. You were the first. Lena shook her head, trying to process the enormity of what she was hearing. I don't understand. If they created me, why did they let me live a normal life? That's the part we don't fully understand yet, Reyes admitted. But we're getting closer. We think they didn't count on you developing free, becoming human. Lena's mind spun. Her entire life had been a lie. Her memories, her family, her very identity. It was all fabricated. I was never meant to be human, she whispered. Reyes' face softened with something close to sympathy. No, Lena, you became human, and that's what made you dangerous to them. Lena sat back, trying to absorb everything. She had been born into a life she never asked for, manipulated from the start. But now she had a choice. She could continue running, hiding in the shadows, or she could fight back. GenTrace might have created her, but they hadn't taken away her ability to choose. And no matter what, she would make them pay for everything they had done. Lena stood up, her resolve hardening. We need to expose them. We need to make sure the world knows what they've done. Reyes looked at her, his eyes serious. We will, but it's not going to be easy. GenTrace won't let this go. They'll come for us. Lena's expression hardened. Then let them come. The next morning, the atmosphere in their safe house was thick with tension. Lena paced back and forth, her mind racing with possibilities and plans. She couldn't shake the image of the files they had uncovered. The project that had shaped her life without her consent. What had been done to her could be done to others, and there were so many others. Reyes, hunched over a laptop, continued to work on deciphering the remaining layers of encrypted files, while Daniel stood near the window, his eyes scanning the empty street below. It was a strange kind of peace in the chaos of their lives, but it wouldn't last. They were running out of time. Lena knew she couldn't wait any longer. The clock was ticking, and every minute they spent hiding only brought them closer to being caught. They had the truth now, but it was useless unless they could expose it to the world. We need a plan, she said, breaking the silence. Reyes didn't look up from the screen, but nodded. I know, but exposing this, we have to be careful. GenTrace has enough power to bury us without a trace. We need to hit them where it hurts, where they won't be able to cover it up. Lena stopped pacing and turned to him. How? Reyes finally glanced up, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. There's a government whistleblower who might be able to help. He used to work at GenTrace, but after he saw some things they were doing, he went underground. His name is Michael Moore. Lena felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. Where do we find him? We don't, Daniel interjected. He's been off the grid for years. But I know someone who might be able to get us in contact with him. A hacker I worked with back in my old life. Lena frowned, remembering the cold, calculating nature of Daniel's past. You think this person can help us? I don't think we have any other choice, Daniel said, his voice firm. I trust him. Reyes stood up, stretching his legs as he moved toward the door. We're running out of time, though. GenTrace will be looking for us, and the longer we stay put, the more likely they'll find us. Lena clenched her fists at her sides. Then we make our move. Now. Daniel's gaze softened for a moment, his expression unreadable. You're sure? Lena nodded, her jaw set. We don't have the luxury of waiting. Every minute that goes by, GenTrace gets closer to destroying everything. They quickly gathered their things, packing up the small safe house as quietly as possible. Reyes grabbed a laptop, ensuring the decrypted files were securely backed up. They would need every bit of evidence to take down GenTrace. Daniel led them to an underground parking garage a few blocks away, where a nondescript black SUV was parked. It didn't attract attention, which was exactly what they needed. He drove with precision, taking side streets and avoiding the major roads. Lena couldn't help but glance out the window every few seconds, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her. They were always being hunted. After a tense drive through the city, Daniel pulled into a dark alleyway, where a man was waiting by a small, beat-up van. He looked scruffy, with dark circles under his eyes, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "Johnny," Daniel said, nodding at the man. "You still in business?" Johnny grinned, showing a row of uneven teeth. "If it pays, I'm in. What do you need?" "We need to get in touch with Michael Moore," Daniel said. "Can you make that happen?" Johnny's smile faded a little. "That's a tall order. The guy's practically a ghost. But I can do it. I'll need a few hours to work my magic." Lena felt the adrenaline surge in her veins. "We don't have a few hours. GenTrace is looking for us. If we wait too long, it'll be over." Johnny raised an eyebrow. "Then I guess we'll have to move quickly, won't we?" He walked over to the van and opened the side door, revealing a labyrinth of wires, monitors, and old computers that looked like they had seen better days. "Get in," Johnny said, his voice gravelly. "Let's see if we can dig up your ghost." Lena hesitated for only a moment before climbing in. Reyes followed her, sitting beside her as Daniel slipped into the front seat, keeping an eye on the alley. Johnny's hands moved swiftly across the keyboard, his eyes flicking from screen to screen. A series of commands and code flashed on the monitors. It was clear that this wasn't Johnny's first time working in the shadows. "Hold on," he muttered under his breath, his fingers tapping furiously. "This is going to take a minute. The deeper I dig, the more firewalls I have to bypass." The minutes felt like hours as Lena tried to steady her breathing. She wanted to trust Johnny. She had to trust him. But in this world, trusting anyone came with a price. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Johnny leaned back in his seat, cracking his knuckles. "Got him," he said with a satisfied grin. "Michael Moore's address is in the system, but it's not in the city. He's hiding in a remote cabin upstate." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "How far away?" 2 hours, maybe less, depending on the road," Johnny said, pulling up a map on the screen. "I'll send the coordinates to your GPS. But listen, don't waste any time. GenTrace will be able to trace the hack in about 20 minutes. You'll need to move fast if you want to make it." Lena nodded. "We'll move." Daniel started the engine, and with a burst of speed, they were on their way, the van's wheels kicking up gravel as they raced toward Michael Moore. Time was running out. The drive was grueling, the tension in the van palpable. The road was winding, cutting through dense woods and towering pines that seemed to close in around them. Every mile felt like an eternity. The air inside the van was thick with anticipation, and Lena's mind was a whirl of thoughts. They were about to meet the one person who could help them expose GenTrace, the company responsible for turning her life into a nightmare. But she couldn't help but wonder, what if Moore was too scared to help? What if he had his own secrets to hide? Johnny's presence in the back of the van only added to the unease. While he had helped them, he was a wild card, and Lena couldn't shake the feeling that his loyalty was more to the money than to the cause. She glanced over at Reyes, who was staring out the window, his face a mask of concentration. He'd been quiet for most of the ride, absorbed in his thoughts, but she knew he was as restless as she was. "Do you think Moore will be willing to help us?" she asked, breaking the silence. Reyes turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "He has no choice. If he doesn't, then we're all dead anyway. We might as well make him an ally before GenTrace catches up to us." Lena nodded but didn't feel reassured. She'd learned the hard way that there were no true allies in this game, just temporary alliances. Moore might help them for now, but would he be willing to face GenTrace's wrath? "Let's just make sure we're ready for whatever comes next," Lena said. "We can't trust anyone completely." Johnny, who had been silently monitoring the road ahead, chuckled. "Smart girl. Trust is a luxury we can't afford." His voice was laced with sarcasm, but there was a cold truth to it. In this world, trust was a commodity, and it was running out fast. Minutes later, Daniel slowed the van as they approached a narrow, dirt road. The trees here were dense, and the sky had begun to darken, casting long shadows across the path. The faint light from the headlights illuminated the uneven road, making the ride even bumpier. "This is it," Daniel said, his voice low. "Stay sharp." The cabin was only a few hundred yards ahead, nestled in a clearing surrounded by thick trees. As they pulled closer, Lena could make out the outline of a small, rustic cabin. It was nothing like she expected. There were no security fences, no guards. Just a solitary building in the middle of nowhere. "Stay in the van," Daniel instructed as he stopped the vehicle. "I'll go check things out." Lena's heart raced. The moment they'd been driving toward for hours had finally arrived. She watched as Daniel slipped out of the van and moved quietly toward the cabin, his movements swift and deliberate. Reyes, still silent, moved closer to the window, scanning the surroundings. Johnny, on the other hand, leaned back in his seat, his fingers idly tapping on the dashboard, seemingly indifferent to the situation. Lena's fingers clenched into fists, and she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her stomach. They were close, but so were GenTrace agents. It wouldn't take long for them to realize they had been hacked, and then the hunt would begin in earnest. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Moments later, Daniel returned to the van, his expression unreadable. "He's here," Daniel said, his voice tight, "but he's not alone. We need to move fast." Lena's pulse quickened. "What do you mean he's not alone?" "I mean, there are 2 armed men inside the cabin with him," Daniel explained. "I don't know if they're on his side or not, but we can't take any chances." Johnny chuckled darkly. "Sounds like the party's just getting started." Lena felt the weight of the decision pressing on her. They could turn back, but that would mean running for the rest of their lives, always looking over their shoulders, always one step behind. Or they could confront whatever awaited them inside the cabin and hope that Michael Moore had the answers they needed. "Let's go," she said firmly. "We're not turning back." Daniel nodded and stepped out of the van once more, leading the way. Lena followed, her mind focused on the task at hand. Reyes and Johnny trailed behind her, moving as silently as possible. They approached the cabin cautiously, the soft crunch of gravel underfoot, the only sound in the otherwise silent night. They reached the front door, and Daniel signaled for them to stop. He peeked inside through a crack in the wooden door, and after a few tense moments, he motioned for them to follow. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with tension. The low hum of conversation was barely audible, but Lena could make out the deep voices of the men talking. Moore's voice was unmistakable, and it held a certain edge of desperation. Daniel crept forward, and Lena felt her breath catch in her throat. This was it. They were about to meet the man who could change everything. But would he help them, or would they be walking into a trap? Without a word, Daniel pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows on the walls. Michael Moore sat at a worn wooden table, his back turned toward them. The 2 men standing beside him were both armed, their expressions hard and distrustful. "Michael Moore?" Lena asked, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. The man at the table turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he studied them. He was older than she expected, with graying hair and a rough, weathered face. His clothes were simple but functional, a faded jacket and cargo pants. But there was something in his eyes, an understanding, perhaps, or maybe it was the weight of years spent hiding from the world. "I don't have time for this," Moore said, his voice gravelly, but there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. "What do you want?" Lena stepped forward, keeping her composure. "We need your help. We know about the project, about what GenTrace has been doing." Moore's eyes flicked to the 2 armed men beside him, who exchanged a glance. For a moment, the air in the cabin felt like it was thickening, as if the entire room was holding its breath. Then Moore stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "And why should I help you?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Because if you don't," Lena said, her eyes steady, "GenTrace will come for us, and they'll come for you, too." For the first time, Moore's expression shifted, a faint glimmer of fear crossing his face. Moore's face went pale as the weight of Lena's words settled in. His gaze shifted to the 2 armed men beside him. and for a moment, the cabin was eerily silent. The men exchanged uncertain glances, as if unsure whether to trust Moore's sudden guests. But the tension in the air was undeniable, thick with the threat of imminent danger. Lena could feel her heart racing, but she refused to let her fear show. She knew they had only one shot at this. "We know what you've been hiding, Michael," Lena pressed, her voice firm. "We have the evidence. The truth about GenTrace experiments, the lies, the manipulation. If you don't help us, all of it will be exposed. You won't be able to run, and neither will we." Moore's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, it was as if the years of secrets and fear caught up with him. He looked defeated, trapped by his past actions, knowing full well that the game he'd been playing was no longer something he could control. "You don't know what you're asking," Moore muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "GenTrace is everywhere. They have eyes, ears. They'll hunt you down. No one is safe." Lena stepped forward, her determination clear. "That's why we need to act now. Together." The two armed men tensed, their hands hovering near their weapons, but Moore raised his hand, signaling them to stay put. He took a deep breath, as if weighing his options, and then finally he spoke. "All right," he said, his voice steadying. "I'll help you, but we're doing this on my terms. I have one shot at this, one chance to bring them down." Lena nodded, sensing that they were on the precipice of something monumental. But the real danger wasn't behind them. It was ahead. "We're with you," she said, looking around the others. Johnny gave her a barely perceptible nod, and Reyes kept his eyes fixed on Moore, assessing him with an intensity that spoke volumes. Moore gestured toward a hidden compartment in the corner of the cabin, where a large, sealed envelope lay waiting. He walked over and pulled it open, revealing a series of photographs, blueprints, and documents. As Moore laid them out on the table, Lena's eyes widened. "This is it," Moore said. "The evidence, the blueprint for their operations, their experiments, the manipulation of the tech they've been using for years. It's all here, but it's only half the story. The rest? It's buried." Lena's fingers brushed over the papers, her pulse quickening as she realized the scale of what they were dealing with. This wasn't just about one company. It was a global operation, and GenTrace had far more influence than she'd imagined. But then, as the weight of the evidence sank in, the door to the cabin suddenly slammed open with a force that shook the walls. The armed men instantly moved to action, drawing their weapons, but Moore was already ahead of them. "They're here," Moore hissed, his face a mass of urgency. "You need to leave now." Before anyone could react, the sound of footsteps echoed outside the cabin. Heavy, determined, unmistakably approaching. They had no time. The realization hit Lena like a jolt of electricity. GenTrace agents weren't just closing in. They were already on their doorstep. "Move!" Moore shouted, shoving the documents toward Lena. "Take this. Get out of here. I'll hold them off as long as I can." Lena hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. "No, we're not leaving you behind." "You don't have a choice," Moore said, his voice resolute. "I'm not running anymore. But you still have a chance. Take the evidence to the press, to anyone who will listen." Without waiting for another word, Moore turned, stepping toward the back of the cabin, where the distant sound of vehicles could be heard drawing nearer. Lena's heart clenched, torn between a man who had just decided to sacrifice himself and the mission that had brought her here. Reyes grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "We have to go. Now." Reluctantly, Lena took the envelope, clutching it tightly in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Even though Moore couldn't hear her, the weight of gratitude mixed with sorrow pressed down on her chest. Without another word, the group moved swiftly, slipping out the back door and into the woods. Lena didn't look back, knowing that Moore had made a stand, and they had to finish what he had started. As they disappeared into trees, the cabin behind them erupted in gunfire. It was chaos, but they kept moving, driven by the urgency of their mission, and the knowledge that everything they were fighting for now depended on the truth getting out. The night air was thick with danger as they pushed forward, their only hope the envelope Lena held, the future of everything resting in their hands. But as the forest closed in around them, one question remained. Would they be able to expose GenTrace before it was too late? The road ahead was uncertain, the danger ever present. But one thing was clear, this was far from over. And as the final shot rang out in the distance, signaling the start of a war neither side was prepared for, Lena knew this was only the beginning.